According to our gospel text this morning, Mary made her way to the tomb while it was still dark. No doubt her heart was in pieces as she returned to the place where her friend had been placed following his cruel and horrific death. And yet upon her arrival at the tomb, she quickly discovered that things were not as they should have been. The stone covering the entrance to the tomb, the stone separating the living from the dead, had been moved. And so Mary ran. She ran with fear and confusion and sadness, likely out of breath, tears streaking across her face, to report, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and I don't know where they have laid him." And so Peter and the other disciple set out running back to the tomb, hoping against hope that Mary was mistaken, but the body was gone. And so the disciples returned home, perhaps uncertain what they could possibly do next. But Mary stayed at the tomb, crying, weeping, wanting to be as close as she could to the place her dead friend once lay. And then all of a sudden, there were angels on the scene. A conversation ensued, and then she turned to find Jesus standing behind her. Only for some reason, she didn't know it was Jesus. Perhaps her grief was so intense, her weeping blurred her vision to the point that she couldn't even see straight. We simply don't know. But then in a moment that likely nearly knocked Mary off her feet, in a moment when the presence of God hit her like a ton of bricks and the barrier between heaven and earth was as thin as she had ever known it to be, the risen Christ called out her name and she recognized him. I imagine Mary struggled to process the moment as it was happening, wondering if she was dreaming or if indeed her friend and her Lord was right in front of her. Mary then left the Lord as he had instructed, and she announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Her announcement was the very first proclamation of Christ's resurrection, and she went out to share the good news. "I have seen the Lord. Come and see." For as long as I can remember, someone in my life has been taking me to church. In their own way, communicating to me, "I have seen the Lord, and I want you to see him too. Come and see." I shared my faith journey with many of you a week and a half ago on Thursday evening during our Lenten supper. And I shared that this whole life of faith was really handed to me on a silver platter. And by that I mean my parents, my grandparents, everyone went to church. We always went to church. Now granted, I spent a good number of years going through the motions of it all, not really engaging with it on a personal level, but it has always been there, beckoning me, calling me time and time again, "Come and see. I have seen the Lord, Rachel, and I want you to see him too. Come and see." But it's hard to see him. The gospel writer even reminds us that at first Mary Magdalene could not see him, even when he stood right in front of her. Even when he was handing her this resurrection truth on a silver platter, even then she couldn't see it. No, instead it took that moment of connection, that moment when Jesus called her name, that moment when the distance between heaven and earth was so thin you could hardly tell them apart. That moment that I would call holy wonder. It took a moment of holy wonder for Mary Magdalene to see her Lord and to know that she was in the presence of God. And then, and only then, could she announce to the world, "I have seen the Lord." It wasn't until the end of high school and even into college that I began to occasionally have experiences of that holy wonder. And by holy wonder, I mean I began to stand in awe a bit more often of this Jesus, caught up in moments or experiences where I was acutely aware of God's presence, overwhelmed at times with emotion and tears as I witnessed what I can only describe as the inbreaking of God's kingdom into our broken world. These moments of holy wonder took my breath away and caused me to stand in awe of the God that I had been taught about all my life, but never really felt before. Granted, on occasion they were simultaneously wonderful and terrifying because I didn't know what this meant for me or for my future or who it was that God was calling me to be. After all, as a seminary professor of mine once said, when God gets a hold of you, you got to go to Staples and get yourself a whole new planner. Because there's no telling what God's going to do with you. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that it was God. Occasionally, I experienced these moments in nature, looking out over the vastness and beauty of God's creation, overtaken with awe and wonder and having nowhere else to point but toward God. There were moments I knew that wonder at funerals, overwhelmed with a sense that this life of faith, this God and this Jesus, it all had to be true. Today, I needed it to be true. I began to encounter people who exuded the love of Jesus in everything they said and did. Adults and peers who had a rich life of faith and wanted to share that faith with anyone who would listen. These were the first moments I can remember having the words and the desire to announce that resurrection hope. I have seen the Lord. And also the first time I wanted to share that announcement with others. In the same moment, I felt both a yearning to come and see more of this holy wonder myself, but also a desire to invite others to come and see more of this amazing God that I was getting to know. Come and see this Jesus. Come and see this living God with me. Some of you may not know, but it wasn't that long ago that I felt an invitation from God to come and see what life and ministry were like here at Morrisville Presbyterian Church. Come and see what God is up to in this place and among these people. This is only the end of my 4th week as your pastor, and yet even in week 1, I knew moments of that holy wonder, startling, terrifying, overwhelming moments of holy wonder when I felt God's presence and I could announce with certainty, I have seen the Lord. During my first week here, I was invited downstairs on Wednesday morning to witness the food center in action. For those of you who don't know about the food center, it is open every Wednesday morning in MPC's basement from 9 a.m. till noon. Clients come from Pennsylvania, but mostly from New Jersey, and they can receive fresh produce, non-perishable items, meats, and breads. On average, the food center serves over 100 individuals or family units each week and over 12,000 individuals or family units each year. All of these were things that I knew before I stepped foot into the fellowship hall during its open hours. What I didn't know was how overwhelmed I would feel by the presence of God in that place. I met a few clients and volunteers as I entered the food center, and then I stood back, witnessing the inbreaking of God's kingdom in the middle of the fellowship hall. It wasn't anything in particular. It wasn't anything specific that anyone said to me, but rather an overwhelming sense that God was there. I didn't stay long, only because I didn't think it would be ideal for folks to see me crying on my 3rd day of work, overcome with the magnitude of God's work before my very eyes. But friends, I had seen the Lord. I was similarly overwhelmed with this holy wonder when I attended my first Lenten supper here at the church. Again, it wasn't anything in particular or any particular thing that anyone said. But I stood singing a hymn at my table near the back, and my eyes filled with tears. In that moment, I stood in holy wonder as I gazed around the room of 40 or so folks who had gathered. Some were old, some were young, some I knew, and some I was meeting for the very first time. But in that moment, I felt my heart opening to this place and to all of you in a way that caught me completely off guard. In an ordinary moment of worship, that holy wonder filled my heart and soul, and I stood in awe of the God who had led me to this place, because, friends, I had seen the Lord. Just a few months ago, I sat in the congregation of a church not far from here and found myself weeping as I watched the church choir. For in that choir, there were college professors and electricians. There were people in their 80s and in their 20s. Within this very church choir, there was black and white, married and single, gay and straight, disabled and abled, and yet they were all singing their hearts out for the glory of God. The holy wonder hit me like a ton of bricks as I realized that in so many other places in our society and in our culture, this motley group of folks would never be in the same place. The barriers that would divide them one from another outside the walls of the church simply vanished under the weight of a choir robe. And suddenly they were one voice and one people and one glowing representation of God's love and God's world. Friends, I have seen the Lord. In each of these moments, as in any moment of holy wonder that I have experienced, there is this pull, this nagging, this yearning for more, as terrifying as it might be, because I have seen the Lord. And I want to invite others to see him too. Come and see what God is doing here. Come and bask in the richness of God's love, for God is here and God is at work. For when the barriers that we've come to expect in this world are broken down and shattered, when we experience one of those thin places where heaven and earth are practically touching, when that holy wonder hits us like a ton of bricks and we feel God's love and God's Spirit and the presence of God's resurrection hope so fully, we find ourselves wanting more, announcing to the world, I have seen the Lord. Someone invited you to come and see today. Someone who has known those moments of resurrection hope and holy wonder in our world and has in some form or another announced to you, I have seen the Lord. Maybe it's you who have been witness to Christ's resurrection hope and been knocked off your feet in holy wonder. Perhaps it is your grandmother or your neighbor or your son who has known that holy wonder and invited you to come and see. But my guess is that whether you'd like to admit it or not, you've been struck by that holy wonder at some point in your life. Caught off guard by the magnitude of God's presence, God's love, and God's resurrection hope. And I recognize that may not be how you would describe it, but my guess is you've been there. Perhaps, like me, you have known this holy wonder in a food bank or in worship or in the song of a church choir. Or perhaps it was in the baptism of a child long prayed for by parents who were told they would never conceive. The invitation of a neighbor to Christmas dinner when she found out your flight home was canceled. The friend who was so sick but had the strength to look you in the eye and tell you she was not afraid to die. The stranger who wouldn't take no for an answer and pushed your cart out of the grocery store, loaded all your groceries into the car because your colicky newborn could not be consoled. The friend who came to the house and did dishes and laundry and cleaned the bathrooms after your father died. The grace your coworker offered to you after you offended him so deeply. The Sunday school teacher who wrote to you every year on your birthday until he died. Your daughter who came home from the mission trip asking if you could start going to church together as a family. That holy wonder catches us by surprise, friends. Every time we experience it, every single time we bear witness to the resurrection hope of our Lord, who breaks down the barriers that divide, who fills darkened corners of our life with love and grace, and who meets us in our weeping and calls us by name. Every single time we proclaim in some form or another, I have seen the Lord. Each and every time we proclaim the truth of our faith that Christ rose from the dead, that we might know the fullness of God's grace and God's mercy and God's love. I have seen the Lord, and I want you to see him too. Come and see. I don't know how you ended up here today. Perhaps this is the place you have always called home and you wouldn't be anywhere else. Perhaps you came to avoid the stern look of your grandmother at lunch later this afternoon. But have you ever asked her what it is that keeps bringing her back to church? Perhaps you came out of habit or because it's the only day each year that you can bear to darken a church door. Perhaps you came because someone invited you or because you needed some of this resurrection hope in the midst of the darkness that you're currently living. I don't know what brought you here today, but I'd be willing to guess that somehow, some way, whether in your heart or in the heart of the one who brought you, there is some holy wonder at work. Perhaps that could be part of your lunchtime conversation this afternoon. But whether you have plans to be here again next week or next month or next Easter, I want you to know that you are always welcome here. And I also want you to know that even in 4 short weeks, just 4 weeks, I have been knocked off my feet by holy wonder among this church family. I have seen the Lord, and I want you to see him too. Come and see. Come and see that this is a place you can feel at home, a place where you can know the abundance of God's love for you. Come and see the incredible ways that this community of faith is loving each other and loving our world. Come and see the God who upends all of our expectations and calls us to live faithful and joyful lives. Come and see the God who breaks down our earthly barriers and brings people together from every walk of life. Come and see, friends, that we certainly do not live perfectly here, but by God's grace, we try to live faithfully. Come and see a God who does not promise to fix everything that's wrong in your life, every broken relationship, or every broken corner of your heart, but a God who does promise to be with you, even in the darkness of a Good Friday. Come and see a God whose love for you is greater than anything you could ever imagine, and come and see the God who was dead but is alive. On that holy Easter morning when it was still dark, and Mary wept at the entrance to that tomb, certain that Jesus' body was gone, certain that someone had taken him away, and certain that death had indeed had the final word. Jesus destroyed the barrier that divided life and death and proclaimed in his resurrection the holy wonder that we stand in awe of today. I have seen the Lord, Mary announced. Come and see for yourselves, friends, for he is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen.